Well, in the last class, we had discussed the differences between nature and culture, and we tried to make sense of how the duality or the dichotomy which exists between nature and culture by citing the examples of the French anthropologist Levi Strauss, and in that he tries to give more of biological explanation of nature and culture by trying to demarcate between the two and trying to espouse gender differences of between men and women and try to relate that with nature and culture. Now, moving on, we will try to look at nature, why nature as a subject is a contested concept, and why is nature perceived or explained by different people or across disciplines in a different way. And more or less we will try to look at how the different trends which are being taken into account, like for instance the primordialists and the constructivists, how they make sense of nature and how nature is being imagined. And also we will try to rely on the works of Bruno Latour and Benedict Anderson, and how they tries to explain and how they conceptualize this very term called nature. And also we will try to engage into looking at the dialectics of what nature is. As I said, why is this particular term nature a contested term, and why does it mean different things to different people across different cultures and generations? And normally this contestation in a way revolve around in three important ways of understanding, and the first thing is nature or the essence of a thing, and the second is nature as a material place external to humanity, that is the nature in itself, and nature as a universal law or reality that may or may not include humans. So, most often times even in this universal law, people tends to avoid including humans in the in relationship with nature. Now, if you look at the works of the literary critic Raymond Williams, he tends to sort of observe that nature is perhaps one of the most complex word, and in order to formulate or support his argument, he tries to give us an explanation how this complexity is interconnected and the meanings which we attribute to nature. Now, the first is the intrinsic nature, that is the essential characteristic of a thing, that is nature in exclusion of the social or the society or the humans. And second is the external nature, that is the unmediated material world, that is the natural environment. And thirdly, it is the universal nature, that in a sense encompass all beings, and of course the human is also part of that. And for instance, nature is seen to be synonymized with mother, which in a sense is again seen to be engaged in nurturing and caring. Now, mother earth, mother nature, these are some of the sort of jargons or terminologies which are being commonly and generally used. Now, Turner, for instance, tends to posit that environment happens to be sort of the primary or central to the geographers or the disciplines of geography, and which in a sense is an integrated environmental science, which is in a sense placed to address the real world problems, that is the physicality. For instance, like flooding, it can be an earthquake, it can be a tsunami, and so on and so forth. Now, for instance, to the physical geographers, they have in a sense elucidated these natural laws governing the movement of water through landscape, and also they tends to engage in predicting nature and the impact of certain calamities like flooding and others. Now, these are perhaps some of the engagement where the physical geographers are normally into. Now, if you look at this concept of nature, which is of course central not only to geography, different from what the geographers in a sense claim, because this concept of nature for long has been beginning from the period of the Enlightenment, and also way back in the 17th century, and even in modern science, there has been an attempt across disciplines and by philosophers in order to distinguish the scientific knowledge from other forms of knowledge, belief, that is the very concept of nature, the meaning which is being attributed, the kind of perceptions, how it is being interpreted, and how one makes sense to nature is in a sense part of a discourse beginning from that period. Now, and it is still pretty much an ongoing, and in the modern context, the anthropological scientists like Bruno Latour also give a modernist version of how this nature is to be seen and interpreted. I will come to that in a short while. Now, first, why is that science often being distinguished from this sort of the belief or the kind of cosmology which we humans have engaged over a period of time? Now, science to some extent tends to engage in bringing an answer through a different kind of tools and methods. Now, science generally distinguishes from this distance from this religious explanation, because it tends to see that this whole idea of this knowledge about nature of things has to be seen in a more objective manner, in the sense that it is not based on subjective belief, but it is more on a direct or if not an objective observation which is impersonal and which is in a sense external and independent reality. Now, in that sense, there is a sort of a boundary which is being drawn between science and religion. They are two separate entities, and in that context, how are we trying to contextualize the debate on this nature or the concept of nature in this debate? Now, because in science there is no, as we have seen, there is no scope for this accommodation of the subjective belief, whereas religion is more of a subjective in nature, because it tends to look at the kind of sentiments, emotions, which in a sense guided the people who practice any forms of religion for that matter. Now, second, positivism also tends to define science in terms of its ability to generate some kind of ability predictions based on a certain kind of hypothesis. Now, normally a scientist before validating or engaging in an empirical study, they hypothesize and then test that hypothesis as to what extent that hypothesis is valid or how it is being proved. Now, in that going by that, what human and these physical geographers share in common is, in a sense, engaging for an essential, necessary and scientifically predictable properties of their respective objectives of the study, objects of their study. Now, if we apply this science and for that matter positivism in trying to understand and make sense of nature, what perhaps could be the way out? Now, as we said that for quite some time geographers or the discipline of geography claims that environment is sort of a subject to them. Now, human geographers in a sense are concerned with the nature of economic growth, and if they looked at this perspective of this economic growth, they would try to seek and identify the laws governing its behavior. Now, in that the physical geographers will try to explain the nature of these hydrological systems and the natural laws governing the behavior of water in different size catchments. Now, similarly, how are we trying to bring in the anthropologists who will try to sort of understand this nature, or maybe say the nature of production, and how are we trying to engage looking at the dialectics of this nature and culture. Now, the question is human nature determined by some inherent biological force like genes, or as many so-called environmental determinists, which we had of course already discussed in the earlier lectures, how environmental determinism in a sense is influencing the human society. And the late 19th and early 20th century belief by our physical environment. Now, or is there any other alternative way out of what distinguishes human from other animals that we can in a sense engage in using our rationality to rise above our base biological instincts? Now, the idea is to move out of these sort of biological instincts or forces in explaining the relations of human and nature. Now, let's look at some of the critique of culture and the plurality of nature. Now, nature in a sense also evolve, and so is culture. This is the general perception, or maybe in other words, nature is seen to be something which is perceived to be static, but nature is no longer what it used to be, and nature is seen to be being deconstructed, and the latter is being sort of naturalized, and yet there is still a continuation of this antagonism which exists between the two, and therefore this dialectics between nature, which is a fact, and nature as imagined has to brought in the kind of shifting dichotomy between this nature and culture is. Thus, we have to maintain some kind of an arguments of looking at the constructivists and the primordialists, how they tries to engage in refashioning and reconciling rather than accept that it's others opposites, because they are trying to sort of find an agreement, a way out of engaging into this. Now, the primordialists are more or less looking at the very first form of what nature is, how humans are related with nature, and most of the anthropologists are in a sense taking the stance of this primordialist, whereas constructivists in a sense engage in looking at how nature in a sense is evolving and it has to be deconstructed. So, this is the stance certain scholars are also taking side with. Now, nature in a sense is not something which is just made up or not just there to begin with as a fact. Rather, the constructedness of this particular, the constructedness has real effect that needs to be sort of understood in its fact, that is the fact T, which has a history that needs to be traced. So, one needs to engage in looking at the sort of the chronology or the history of that fact. Now, perhaps these two can in a way bring in a different forms of perspective by paying attention to the ways in which this nature is engaged through human varieties of practice and imagination. Now, what is practice and imagination? Practice, no doubt, is more empirical, and imagination is more of a construction which we humans are normally engaged in. Now, what is this imagination, and how do we employ that in trying to make sense of nature, that is in understanding nature? Now, the emergence of nature in a sense as a conceptual scientific problems tends to bring in a more engaging questions because of the political focus on these environmental issues, which has of course been placed a much more important positions in the academic discourse. Now, nature in a sense is also being argued as historical, cultural and a social construct with embedded with a certain emotion, moral and certain kind of political consciousness. Now, one also needs to sort of understand the political ecology, if not the politics of nature, and thereby establishing a historical and cultural and also the social historicity of what nature is. Now, the anthropologists like Roy Allen and Fukui in a sense draws our attentions in redefinition or redefining what nature, and also the reconstruction of nature, which is espoused by Dickens, whereas other schools of thought also talks about how to engage in the cultural construction of nature, that is by Eder and Simons, and also the invention of nature, and also to look at the social or historical creation of what nature is by different scholars. Also, others have still stressed on a different way out, that is the cultural perceptions of and attitudes towards natures which are being constructed. Remember, I will try to look in the two different ways, that is the primordialist and the constructivist. what then is nature? If we are to generally accept nature is something which is being constructed, perceived and classified according to the historical, social, cultural and political context, this would in a sense require a kind of redefining or rethinking, because through this rethinking processes, of course, there will be construction, perception and also classification of nature. Now, how would we engage in doing this? This could perhaps be done through range of analysis, which in a sense focuses on the practices of nature, that is, the human practices that depend upon or are involved in generating a particular perception and categories of nature. And these practices of nature are in a sense a feedback or a looping relationship with the environment, making them both sort of producers of natures and the products of nature. Remember these two definitions of what producers of natures and the products of nature. The way we tend to perceive and contextualize or share a relationship with nature can be in a sense located in these two parameters, that is the producers of natures and the products of nature. Now, anthropologists for quite some time has in a way criticized this the constructivist stance because they don't really allow the environment to play an active role, which means letting the environment by itself, giving a free hand. But opposing to this, the constructivists or constructivism also make their positions clear by saying that they have a way of reproducing itself in a new and unexpected ways that is evidenced in many recent attempts to reconstruct our understanding of nature. Now, first and foremost, the anthropological understanding of nature and culture, which were being posited by scholars like Descola and Pelson, what they see is the dualistic nature between nature and culture. Perhaps was the starting point for different school of thought, and although it performed these functions in a different ways. On the one hand, there is this school of thought which engage in the materialist interpretations such as Marxism, cultural ecology and sociobiology, and how they try to make sense or regarded this culture as an environmental, if not a materialistic or physical reality. On the other hand, there are some school of thought which belong to the symbolic and structuralist anthropology, which use nature culture dichotomy as a basic classificatory device, which in a sense enable them to interpret and understand the various types of these cultural phenomena, and cultural phenomena not outside environment but in relationship with environment. Now, giving this sort of breaking them up, there are different school of thoughts even within anthropology and also others like the Marxist school of thought, which tends to make sense of nature. Now, the former Stroff school of thought in a sense strive to establish a natural ordering of culture, whereas the latter advocate an understanding of the cultural order of nature. The natural and the cultural, these two differences is being posited by Marcel Salins, and from this process of reconsidering nature very much like culture, there emerges a historical, contextual and specific, and therefore the attempt has to be more in the context and specificity of what nature is, or in other words, the theoretical critique of the homogeneous and static character of the concept of this culture. Now, although there is a critique of this culture which has been acknowledged, the consequences have not been thoroughly, in a sense, incorporated in understanding how nature emerges out of a dialectic between human perception and human practice, that is, the differences between practice and imagination, at the same time as human practice and perceptions are no doubt shaped by their history of engagement with nature. Now, the idea is what is the first form or the first instances of the human engagement with nature historically. We'll look into that. Now, I try to give you an explanation slightly different from what we have looked into, that is to look into the dialectics of nature, that is in understanding the origin of ecology, that is the conceptions and perceptions of nature. Now, there are a new views of this nature as there is a development of this materialism and science. For example, the green theory, which talks about which in a sense is looking at nature as something which is separate, if not the environment is to be seen in engaging in a more wilderness thinking. This perhaps is a new way of ecological thinking. Now, there is an evolution of weaving at nature as well, the way we perceive and the way we try to locate and understand nature. And alongside there is this a social transformation which is taking place. Now, what is this social transformation? How there is a transformation of human relationship with nature, the kind of relationship which is being established between human and nature in terms of, let us say, the economic production, for instance. Now, Marx in a way tries to bring in the economic production in trying to explain the relationship between human and nature, that is ecology, and he bring in the idea of this materialism, or what is popularly known as the materialistic interpretation of history. Now, it is important for us to locate or begin or historicize how this relation has begun. Now, Russell in a way talks about the origins and development of whatever exists is dependent on nature as matter, that is the physical reality that is independent of and prior to thought. So, what Bertrand Russell says is the physical reality in a sense is prior to the existence of human thought. That is, physical reality has already exist prior to the human perception of nature. That is to be divided into three ways, that is the ontological, epistemological and practical. Now, what is ontological? Because ontological in a sense is dependent on the social, that is the biological, which is physical in nature, and epistemological is more of a scientific engagement of thinking, that is independent existence. It tends to come up with a scientific ways of asking or trying to answer things, that is the epistemology. Whereas in the practical, that is the role of human transformative agency in the reproduction and transformation of these social forms. Now, in this materialist conception of history, Marx in a way tries to focuses on the practical materialism, that is the relations of man and nature were practical from the outset, that is relations established by action. Maybe if you look at the sort of the agriculture society, the first and foremost of human engagement or relationship with nature is in tilling the field or plowing the field, and that perhaps is the starting point of the human nature relations. And in that, how does one establish this relation, and how a materialistic view of nature of things provided this essential basis for a conception of human freedom, that is maybe idealism versus materialism. What is this idealism again? It is sort of a perception and ideas which is being produced over time, which is not real, right? But whereas materialism is more of a physical reality. And if you look at the economic production which is propagated by Marx in the capitalist society, he talks about the alienation of human labor, that is how an individual or a worker is being denied any kind of relationship with the whatever he produces, that is human is seen to be not the producers of nature, but the products of nature. Now, human has historically been in constant struggle with nature, and in the process happens to engage in certain kind of exploitation of nature. Now, I'll just quickly try to bring in the Marxian approaches. No doubt, I'll give a detailed picture in the upcoming lectures when we talk about the Marxian perception or approaches of environmental ethics. For just general understanding, Marx, no doubt, has been criticized for not really bringing the ecological issues in his works, but then there has been sort of an understanding in terms of the collective struggle, that is the transition from consumerism, individualism and domination of nature. When this consumerism and individualism has to be seen in terms of how an individual is engaging in dominating nature, that is trying to bring in certain kinds of profit or driven by the idea of the surplus. So, once this idea of profit and surplus tends to guide the individuals, the humankind engage in certain forms of domination of nature. That is, Marx in a way also tries to explain further by bringing in this idea of this the socialist thought, that is to replace the quality of life and so on and so forth. Now, through this emergence of this consumerism or individualism, there is a social transformation which is taking place, that is the quality of life, that is from a simple to a more complex, or maybe in terms of accumulation of wealth, and people don't really satisfy themselves, or they don't find it adequate to have a certain kind of a subsistence way of life, rather they have yearn for more, and the form of this solidarity or changes. Earlier, as Durkheim has talked about, the earlier agriculture, if not the simple primitive societies, were more mechanical in character, but the industrial capitalist society is more organic in nature, or maybe the organic solidarity comes in too, and they are being driven by certain kind of skills, and they are more dependent, and as more and more individuals become skillful in their jobs, they tend to become more dependent, and the society doesn't in a way break up, but then it has evolved into a different form of solidarity, and also the sort of ecological sensibility also has changes. So, what socialism in a way tries to look at is there has to be a shift or changes in terms of the human perception, that is priority should be given to need rather than profit, that is the surplus. So, if one go by this idea of need rather than profit, perhaps maybe the kind of relationship between human and nature will change, and the domination of nature might not be the case, and also human equality rather than solidarity. Equality because as individualism and materialism or consumerism comes into play, there has been a lot of inequality and differences, and sort of a class emerges in society. Like for example, in industrial society we have the proletariat and the bourgeois. The bourgeois are those who controlled the products, and they have this power since they have that capital. Now, many of the socialist thinkers in a way are trying to redefine this ecological thinking by trying to inject the essence of ecological sustainability, or rather they try to they believe in trying to espouse the egalitarian human development. Now, if we give a social explanation of this between human and nature, that is the social metabolism, there has been a metabolic relationship between society and nature, that is human social relation to nature. So, one needs to establish how this relationship has broken, and then how it should be redefined and reconstructed. Now, Marx in a sense gave a critique to the capitalist class society by saying that there is an antagonistic tension between the use value and exchange value, that is there is sort of an internal problems or contradictions within capitalism, and this conflict in a way result to sort of dominating, if not the external natural environment. So, now what is the way out? The nature and this labor, that is the dual resources of wealth, capitalism in a way ensure that ecological and the social cost of production would be in a sense excluded. Now, how do we try to address and look at this, the ecological degradation then? It in a way eventually lead to some kind of the environmental proletariat, that is those who don't really have a say or owned the resources, that is the environmental proletariat, the have not in a way. Now, this whole gamut or dynamics of how the social and nature, that is the human and nature, has to be relooked and redefined in the context of Marx's critique or understanding of the internal contradictions which evolve in the capitalist society. Now, as I talk about why one should engage in imagining or imagination of nature, or maybe or the way we perceive this nature, because there are different imaginings which involve in the context of this nature, which becomes more of a moral realities that in a way has sort of impacted on the local practices of identity, as well as the scientific knowledge practices. Now, this dialectical relationship which exists between practice and imagining has been in a way explored in detail by Benedict Anderson in his work The Imagined Communities. Now, the reason why I am trying to bring in this imagined communities, the work of Anderson, is to look at how this imagining of nature, how one tries to imagine themselves not restricting to a particular geographical space, but rather across boundaries. So, by engaging in this imagining, one does not really limit to or restrict oneself to an ecological needs. Now, what Anderson in a way tries to explain is that the idea of this modern nation, when we talk about nation, a nation is a group of people or a community which inhabit a geographical space different from others. So, this nation, the modern nation, what Anderson talks about is in the modern context, a nation does not necessarily has to have a state, that is even within a particular territory or a state there can be multiple nations. Therefore, this idea of nation has to be historically located because of the development of these specific institutional practices and technologies, maybe with the advancements of science and technology. Now, if you look back maybe a few hundred years before, to meet and then interact with someone, you have to physically venture yourself, traveled days and night to visit someone. But if you look at the kind of advancement of science and technology, within the friction of second, you can in a way be in touch. There can be always a virtual communication between two people, or maybe across different communities. Now, therefore, because of this sort of the technologies, the human or the national collective does not necessarily have to be stay together, or maybe they can be in a different spaces, but they still can have this imagination to imagine themselves as a community, and which of course are being guided by that the primordialist nature of their oneness, maybe through their culture, maybe through myth or certain kind of historical connections, which of course share a common past, present and future, maybe within a common territory which is being defined by a fixed boundaries. So, these new ideas of this symbolic universe, the virtual, was in a way made possible by these reproductive technologies and media, as well as by new institutional forms of communication, what Anderson says as the print capitalism. Now, this notion of this imagined community, which is posited by Anderson, in a way allow us for a careful and a subtle understanding of how nation could be at the same time real and constructed. Now, even when this nation is guided by this notion of primordialism, it can still be constructed, and so is culture. Now, he in a way tried to show that this imagining oneself as a part of national community arose as a possibility with the transformation of a whole series of institutional, technological and scientific practices. Now, therefore, one has to locate in trying to make sense of oneself in time and space. Now, what is this imagining nature then? Imagining nature again can in a way implies an extension into different directions. Firstly, from the original concept of what we discussed in imagined communities. First, it sort of tends to shift from a passive imagine to the active procedural imagining, and this shift in a sense is central to the practice of the perspective which is usually being advocated. And secondly, the inclusion of the term this nature, which in essence is sort of an expansion of the entirely social entity, that is the community, to a much more inclusive, that in a sense encompasses the relations in which humans are implicated. Now, therefore, these sort of relations which exist not only between social human actors, but also the humans in relations to different entities, that is the non-human actors such as spirits, landscape, resources, machines or animals. Now, if one has to perceive landscape in relations to some kind of a past memory, some kind of a cultural landscape in a way can be created out of that. Now, therefore, the relations which usually exist between only a community now is being transformed, and then it in essence encompass the other entities which we had just talked about in the non-human actors, that is the spirit, landscape, so on and so forth. Now, a bit slightly different from what Benedict Anderson has discussed in the imagined communities by trying to bring in imagining nature. Bruno Latour, a French philosopher and anthropologist, again has proposed the term called collective to encompass these sort of interrelative amalgamation of humans and non-humans. Now, by exploiting that very term called imagining nature, nature in essence is to be established in a more institutional, scientific and political discourse as an entity which is out there, which is outside the human or the social. Now, in a way, this cosmological understanding, that is the cosmology, in a way contributed to understanding this process of this imagining. That is, we tend to engage in segregating things, that is the natural from the social or cultural, is one of the sort of general trends which is being witnessed in the modern parlance, that is the modern construction or the modern constitution. Therefore, cosmology in a way tries to understand this process of imagining. Now, therefore, instead of simply positing an imagined community faced with the real nature, the contributions of this imagining nature in a way tends to look at the way a collective understood all these amalgam of people and the non-humans, which are to be located and understand in a much more organized practice and imagined in a variety of settings. Now, in this sense, nature becomes an aspect of an agent in the constitution of imagined collectivities. Now, how do we try to locate or understand this nature in the context of nation? Now, as we had discussed in the Anderson's metaphor, that is, which in a way is being more supported. Now, if we try to decode this or break up this in a more etymological sense, nation in Latin is to be born, that is to be born in a particular place, or nature which is something born, which in a sense indicate that they share a common semantic history of being associated with origin and emergence. Now, however, at the semantic level, this nation and nature are in a way connected, because even nature has sort of an origin and emergence, because the ties are also pretty much clearly discernible in the historical emergence of this nationalist ideology. And for our understanding of this concept of nature, or the purpose of this nation and nature, which in a sense appear to share some kind of commonalities, and if we tend to see from a very analytical perspective. Now, Anderson's analysis of this nationalism tends to bring out an important mediation between two positions on the origin of nation, that is, which I said, the first one, which is a primordialist interpretation, which in a sense is being used by many nationalists, or who tends to claim themselves to be sort of being espoused or guided by a certain kind of nationalism. Or maybe if, for example, multiple ethnic communities tends to inhabit the same geographical space, there has been a boundary which is usually being drawn between us and them, we and they. So, those sort of demarcations are politically guided in nature, and they tends to bring in the idea of this aborigines, nativity, nativism, and being indigenous. So, all these characters again is being guided by this primordialist interpretation. This manifestation in a sense is founded upon a primordial attachment to a land, or maybe a soil, the ethnic origin. Now, there, if you look across around the world, when there is a contestation between different ethnic groups, this whole idea of sons of the soil, who actually tends to first immerse, or the originality of that particular community is usually being discussed here. Now, in other plans, as we talk about this invention, nation were in a sense constructed, and also it has a historical entities, is what the constructivists claimed, which is opposite to what the primordialists just says. But nations also were also factually existing agents in the modern world, whose significance could be understood in that sense. Now, as culture can be constructed, so can there be a construction of this nation. Now, what Latour tried to bring out is nature has to be also seen as a factis, that is the anthropological phenomena, which arguably also tries to locate these epistemological between the real and the really made up. Now, in this premise, Bruno has in a way proposed a new name for such hybrid, namely that is the factis. Now, what is a factis? A word that in itself is a hybrid between a fact and a fetish. Like what fetishism is. People yearn or urge or a fetishist. They are craving for something. Now, if that sort of idea of this factis is being brought in the context of nature and nation, both apparently it tends to belong to the awkward class of a phenomenon that one lack for better, the word may call factices. A phenomena therefore are at once constructed and real, which is also processual and independent in nature. Now, this sort of idea in a sense is a central issue in the context of the philosophy and anthropology of science in perhaps in the last decade, and which has been a social constructionism debate. Now, the discussion here is whether to ask the natural sciences as real, that is outside the social constructionism, and also whether this natural science is also part of socially constructed, that is a mere reflections of ideology and interest among the scientists and scientists which are in a way engaging in producing them. Now, this discussion in a way tries to sort of reflect a central differences between science which devote to nature and culture respectively, and what Latour claims. Now, the natural science obviously tends to focus more on nature, and the anthropologist on the other hand is more focusing on the study of culture. Now, what is the dichotomy, and then what is the connecting link between natural science and social science in a way? Latour further argues that natural sciences strive to in a way deduce or eliminate the intervention of human into scientific inquiry in order to ensure the truth of its facts, because it claims to engage in a scientific engagement in bringing the reality, that is the truth or fact. Now, this sort of epistemological conflict which usually prevail between these two scientific culture has in a way tends to bring out some kind of a modern constitution, that is a certain conceptual division of the world that in a way relegates the phenomenon into distinct categories, that is nature on one side and society on the other. That sort of division which is normally being espoused by Latour. Now, Latour also further suggests that this epistemological conflict between nature and culture is an organizing principle in the modern constitution. Now, this epistemological opposition which exists between nature and culture in a way tends to achieve its congruent social form in the scientific division of labor, that is the opposition between the social and the natural science appears less clear when one studies carefully the actual scientific practices. Now, this opposition again will be in a way valid as long as the human agency is not factored into the equation. Now, Latour's research in a way led him to identify the blind opposition between nature and culture as the basic opposition organizing modernity, because a modernity which, as Anderson has highlighted, has nations as the general principle of social organization. Therefore, no matter how modernized we are, still we are still encompassed by that idea of a nation, whether it's real or imagined. Now, the nature and effect of modern human practices. Over here, we'll try to see how the institutions which are normally set up within nations, the kind of relationship between human practice and the natural change within modernity becomes even more apparent. Now, we have now become accustomed to the sort of the tristis tropes, that is the relationship between environmental degradation, pollution, deforestation. But human practice in a way tends to save this nature in other ways too, by often engaging in creating the supposedly the pristine nature that is nation and natural environmentalists seeks to preserve. That is what I talk about in that green theory, or with many of the present day the green environmentalists. They tend to see nature, or tends to engage in preserving nature in a more pristine way. That is, they are being guided by that idea of this wilderness thinking. Now, in cosmology, what we looked at is the dialectical relationship, which in a way tends to engage in the relationship between imaginings and practices of nature, which in a way has unfolded at least two different domains. That is, one which is related to the production of knowledge, and the other which is related to the production of identity. So, this production of knowledge and identity is something which is to be seen in the context of the dialectical relationship between imaginings and the practices of nature. Now, within this, the first domain, that is nature, in a way is an object of scientific and popular knowledge, and which in a way is an encompassing conception of the world that anthropologists traditionally tries to give a name called cosmological. Now, therefore, this term cosmology in a way tends to denote this domain in which nature is produced by and produces certain moral knowledge practices. Now, different societies and different culture group has different cosmology. That is, the way they perceive and tends to interpret and look at nature. Now, cosmology in a way is anthropological fact, something that anthropologists can construct as a synthesis of the way the thinking of those so-called aborigines or the native people about how they make sense of the universe, that is the sky, art, gods and people, and the right, the good and beautiful. So, that sort of judgment, the imaginings of nature in a way is being guided within this rubric of this cosmology, and perhaps which is different again in the jargons which is being usually used by the natural sciences. Now, according to the natural sciences, cosmology is mainly understood to be sort of an objective subdiscipline of, say for example, the astrophysicists that deal with origin and fate of the universe. Now, the way the natural science interpret the universe and the way the human society interpret the universe is again different, even when they use the same jargons called cosmology. So, therefore, in this popular conception in humanities, cosmology is the domain of the supernatural, the spiritual and the unreal, but also which is the unseen realm of systemicity which in a sense governs the human life. Now, across societies, the conceptions of God, nature, individual differs, and many anthropologists tend to make an extensive study of the simple societies, the aboriginal, the native, and they have different kinds of a cosmology. For instance, while nature may in one view, namely in the hard sciences, that is in sociobiology or cultural ecology, function as a cosmogenic principle behind things, that is the cultural the trend within which the constructivist classify the cultural perception, the ordering principle of nature. Now, therefore, when we talk about this cosmology in the discipline of anthropology, it in a way engaged in trying to make a social classification or a cultural perception or the ordering principle of nature. I'll stop here, and overall what we have discussed is concept of cosmology, which is sort of appropriated across discipline in a different way. Normally in anthropological understanding, it is more to do with how the native societies in a way tends to make sense of their universe. So in a way, cosmology is nothing but the worldview, how they perceive their surroundings, at the same time the universe where one's reside. So therefore, this cosmology in a way is nothing but a production of knowledge, and also at the same time in the process it produces one's social and cultural identity. Now, therefore, this dialectical relationship which actually exists between imagining and practice of nature tends to unfold in a different way. Now, within this domain of cosmological understanding or knowledge, nature in a way is produced by more of a certain moral knowledge practices. Now, as I had discussed, some of the kind of understanding from different approaches of how one makes sense of nature, there has been sort of a division which exists between the anthropological understanding of nature, at the same time the natural sciences. Now, to the natural sciences, cosmology is mainly understood as more of an objective subdiscipline of astrophysics, and cosmology in the real sense, from the understanding of anthropology, if not humanities, is more of the domain of the supernatural, the spiritual, the unreal, which in a sense is unseen, but which in a way governs the human life. Now, if you look at some of the European societies, which are perhaps seen to be much more formalized, if not civilized, there sprang of two contradictory, if not opposing domains, which in a way is governed by the relative human law, which we call it society. What is society? Society is something which is made up of certain kinds of institutions which develop over time. That is, if you go by the evolutionary understanding of human society, it sort of move on from the simple to a complex kind of understanding. This particular intrinsic understanding of not only the universe but also of God, nature, and the individual. Now, this larger understanding domain of this term cosmos, in a sense, is an orderly, harmonious, systematic universe, and also a complex, orderly, self-inclusive system. Now, therefore, if we, for example, take the nature, one may in a sense view from the standpoint of the hard sciences or the natural sciences like sociobiology or cultural ecology. It in a way function as something, a principle behind like the cultural, if not within the constructivist anthropology, has recently been realized, and there is a social classifications or cultural perceptions of the principle of ordering nature. Now, one of the recent focus of these politics of nature in a way has also tends to reconceptualize our understanding or perception about nature, and therefore cosmology in a sense tries to demonstrate the engagement with nature, which in a way is both discursive as well as practical, and which happens to be sort of a part of the encompassing cosmology, that is a moral regime of knowledge and a practical getting to know the world. Now, there can be different methods of making sense of the world. Now, if you take the simplest example of the native societies, why they engage in certain kinds of rituals and ceremonies, in a sense, those practices are more to do with the kind of how one engages or try to make sense of their universe, how they perceive, and how they sort of try to constantly or interact in their everyday life in making sense of the universe or the surroundings. Now, in Gould's understanding, how he tries to, the perception of environment, if not how an individual is engaging in their environment, argued that humans are nothing but the living organisms who both purposefully and habitually act in the world. Now, this argument in a way takes us to make the understandings of the life world, that is also being bent and transformed by the human praxis. That is, when I say praxis, it is the constant practices engagement in the real world, that is our constant engagement with the physical world. Now, therefore, in this discussion, our contention, or from what we have drawn from the scholars working in this field, is that nature in a way is simultaneously semiotized and real. And by saying so, as such, nature is both the product of human practice and its conditions of possibility. Now, in this understanding, the notion of nature in a way is maintained only in the context of specific and dynamic process. Now, one should try to locate nature contextually, and not just merely by trying to see in a very objective or objectified manner. Now, by taking the works of Latour mainly, how this idea of nature and the human relationship is evolving, and it has to be in a sense understood in a more contextual and in a more specific worldview of those communities which are engaged into. Now, I sum up that how nature in a sense is a contested concepts. These are some of the references which would perhaps make our understanding much more simpler and easy, and then I'll stop here.